has been said repeatedly that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Hi there, and welcome to our channel, and to my personal well-paved road to plastic mayhem, aka Model Builder's Hell. The model parts are in a relatively big box, which contains a surprising amount of plastic sprues. This decision was probably to make the sprues portable between different versions of Academy's F4 kits, as there were many leftover parts after I finished the build. At least, I hope this was the reason I had so many leftover bits. That said, the parts on the sprue trees were of excellent quality, with hardly any excess flash or seam lines. This made cleanup of the parts a lot easier. They were nicely detailed with recessed panel lines and rivets, which would look great after a panel wash. The clear parts for both kits were packaged separately and were pretty good. They were nicely transparent and free from any imperfections, except for a nasty seam line in the middle of one of the canopy parts, which would have to be addressed at a later stage. I was very excited when I saw the kit included 3 pilot figures, 2 of them seated and 1 standing.
My first paving stone.
I intended to build the kit with canopies high and pilots waving excitedly. In my defense, I was a year and a half younger then. The kit also contained a fine collection of ordnance for the aircraft, including sidewinders, sparrows, shrikes, and Mark 82s. The instructions were on a large fold-out and well illustrated with several key paint callouts and were fairly easy to understand. I say fairly easy because when it came to the auxiliary intakes and the landing bay doors, the instructions were a little muddy. I found a need to consult reference pictures to make sure everything went where it was supposed to. But like I said, I was more than a year younger at the time. In just 15 easy steps, the model would be completed. The decals for both models were colorful and crisp, and plentiful. Just how many decals were there? And with that, it's time to embark on a journey to a pandemonium of plastic chaos. My only request, if you haven't already done so, please hit the like and subscribe buttons, which helps us to feed that hungry YouTube algorithm monster.
My second paving stone.
My intention was to kill 2 birds with 1 stone and do a double build of 2 near identical models, the US Marines F4 Grey Ghosts and the US Navy's F4 Diamondbacks, both Academy kits in 48 scale. In theory, this seemed like a good idea as it meant that I only needed to select 1 set of paints and follow 1 set of instructions for both models. In the process, I could learn from my mistakes on one model and not repeat it on the other. Okay, I'll admit this kind of worked, but things did get a bit divergent when it was time for painting and applying decals. And there were subtle differences in the paint schemes and part numbers, which meant that both sets of instructions needed to be referenced constantly. I was most excited about the included pilot figures, so I started with them first. Their parts were separated from their sprue trees, and I used a scalpel to carefully scrape away at any seam lines. There were 2 seated pilots and 1 standing, ready for action.
It's time to kick ass and chew bubble gum, and I'm all out of gum.
They each received a coat of paint and a wash of army painted dark tone. Then I called them done. My next step was to identify the parts of the sub-assemblies which needed to be painted white. These included air intakes, landing gear, and the doors and interiors of the landing bays. I used an airbrush and painted them still attached to their sprues, which made it easier to identify them later, but also held the bits nice and steady for the duration. The first step in the instructions was to assemble the front landing gear and the cockpit. This part was incredibly fragile, so of course I managed to break it twice. For the most part, I used the Guns Mr. Hobby paint callouts as per the color table in the instructions. The tub of the cockpit was painted dark grey and the separate sections flat black. There were no decals for the cockpit details, but quite extensive instructions on how to paint them. I glued in everything except the pilot seats, as I reasoned that down the road it would make the job of masking and painting a little easier. The rear landing gear bays were somewhat tricky to build, but eventually I managed to get everything lined up. Once the lower fuselage was freed from its sprue, some extra cleanup was done to remove the nubs on the sprue runners. The instructions called for some holes to be drilled into the fuselage. These were optional, and this step can be ignored if one is building the model without weapons mounted. Another step in the pre-build preparations is to paint the engine nozzles. Burnt iron is applied to some sections of the exhaust nozzles, while others were made silver. The rear landing bays proved to be a challenge to install. Once all of the sub-assemblies were built, the lower fuselage could be fitted together. The portion of the model where the forward and aft parts of the fuselage meet up appeared to be very rudimentary, so I decided to reinforce the seam joint with a couple of small styrene strips. Finally, it was time to join together the upper and lower halves of the fuselage. Next up, I assembled the tail fin and horizontal stabilizers. The horizontal stabilizers required some complex coats of metallic paint. In retrospect, I should have painted these first before assembly. Ah, the follies of youth. The wheels were painted and assembled. They would be added to the model near the end of the build. I chose different configurations for the missiles for each of the two models, and proceeded to build the missiles that were required. And with that, one fine Saturday morning, before going out to the movies, I applied some filling putty to the gaping seams of both models.
My third paving stone.
I intended to let the putty dry for the day, and would come home that night to sand it down flush with the model surfaces.
19 months later.
19 months later, I picked up the models again and dusted them off. Those 19 months were by no means uneventful, but for the most part, I'd simply lost my model building mojo and hung up my sprue cutters for a spell. Additionally, if I have to be honest with myself, I had really rushed the builds of these models, and I wasn't much looking forward to going back and finishing them. There were nasty seam lines all over the place, and areas where glue had oozed out, had even melted some areas of the models. Without a doubt, the kits themselves are excellent, but the guy who built them just wasn't feeling it at the time. So you could say myself from the past had just handed future me a couple of lemons. But when life gives you lemons, you grab the salt and the tequila. To get myself back into the groove, I kick-started my mojo by applying paint to the various bombs and missiles. I added their decals and a coat of varnish, and using the instruction guide, I glued both sets of missiles to their pylons according to the configurations I had selected previously, and got them ready for attachment to the models later. I attempted to sand down most of the old putty, which had become hard and brittle over time, and re-scribed a few of those panel lines. I used a dark grey to pre-shade the panel lines, taking care to use light coats and focus on the deeper recesses. After allowing a few moments for the pre-shading to dry, I used the airbrush to gently apply a thin coat of light grey across the surface of the model. To preserve as much of the pre-shading as possible, I usually aim my airbrush for the middle of each panel and slowly work my way towards the edges of those panels. Sometimes this creates a stark contrast and the pre-shaded panel lines are way too dark. When this happens, I'll do a second quick pass with the airbrush over the entire surface of the model, which blends the paint layers and creates a more realistic finish. The vertical stabilizer on the Grey Ghosts fighter had to be masked off and painted dark blue. I repeated this whole process for the Diamondbacks model, applying grey paint to both the upper and lower fuselage.
My fourth paving stone.
Unfortunately, I had not read the instructions. Normally, I'm quite meticulous when it comes to instructions, but my extended hiatus had rusted up the old model building noggin. The second aircraft, the F4 Diamondbacks, was actually supposed to have a white underbelly. Also, the flaps on the rear of the aircraft and the ailerons on the wings needed to be white too. Luckily, my previous coat of paint was applied as a very light layer. This meant I could simply redo the panel lines and undo the mistake without the need for an extensive cleanup. I masked off the grey areas and once again did some pre-shading. This time I followed up with the correct paint, Mr. Color 316. Nowadays, I use a small saw blade to gently separate the canopy sections from their sprue runners. Using scalpels and sprue cutters on brittle clear parts sometimes has disastrous results. At least they do for me, anyway. I mentioned before that one of the canopy sections had a prominent seam line. I started with a relatively coarse 600 grit sanding sponge and sanded the seam line flush with the rest of the canopy. I followed up with a finer 2500 sanding sponge and used Tamiya polishing compounds to make everything bright and shiny again. Part of the front section of canopy needed to be painted with Tamiya clear green. I used a liquid mask to screen off the areas which had already been painted. The Tamiya clear green paint was airbrushed carefully over several light passes.
My 5th paving stone.
In a moment of sheer insanity, I decided it was time to glue in the pilot seats, along with the smiling and waving pilots and the canopy glass. This was an utterly stupid decision, as I still needed to apply decals, several coats of varnish, and do some weathering on the aircraft. My half-wit decision created the need for masking and remasking of the canopy every step along the way. At any rate, this was also around the time that I found out that the pilots don't fit. At least, not in the way that I had planned to do things. Maybe, if I'd glued them into place before assembling the fuselage halves, as the instructions clearly showed, I might have been more successful. Eventually, I admitted defeat, and with a heavy heart, I glued the empty chairs and canopy into place. Luckily, I realized that I had been somewhat impetuous when I installed the Grey Ghost's cockpit, so I left the Diamondbacks cockpit for later. But sadly, neither aircraft would ever accommodate those cheerful pilots. Before the decals were applied, both aircraft received a light misting of Tamiya TS13 clear gloss varnish. This not only seals in the paint, but also provides a glossy surface which prevents the decals from silvering and helps them to conform to the details on the model's surface. I started with the Grey Ghosts and laid down the biggest decals first. The decals are of excellent quality, strong and easy to work with. Once done, I applied some extra setting solution and left the model to rest overnight. The setting solution fixed the decals in place and helped them to soften up to a point where the surface panel lines were visible again. Next up was the Diamondbacks. Once again, I started with the largest decals and worked my way down to the smaller ones. As a precaution, I always do a high-resolution scan of a model's decal sheet, just in case something goes wrong and I need to print another set. This time, in the process of scanning, I accidentally ripped some of the decals. Luckily, the damage was minor, to the point where I could repair them on the fly. I'm not going to lie, the copious amount of decals meant that I spent a full weekend laying them down on the two models. But with the amount of detail they added to the aircraft, it was well worth the effort. After another light application of TS13 gloss varnish, which helps the decals look more like paint and less like stick-ons, I got to work on the panel lines. I used Tamiya black accent color and allowed the thin fluid to wick into the panel lines and rivets. Once the accent color dries, it's easy to clean up the excess using artist's white spirit or lighter fluid.
My 6th paving stone.
Originally, I had intended to be super careful with the fragile parts of the aircraft, especially the landing gear. To my horror, my ham-fisted approach to model building had caused me to snap off 3 of the 4 delicate landing gear struts. The tiny parts had been fed to the carpet monster months ago. I mixed up some epoxy glue and glued into place whatever I managed to salvage of the landing struts. Luckily there were a lot of unused parts still on their sprues, and I could use these to improvise some ad hoc details. It was difficult to keep the landing bay doors in the correct position while their glue cured, so I used cocktail skewers and poster tack to ensure their correct orientation. As mentioned, the instructions for the models were a little difficult to follow at this point, so reference pictures were very helpful. After a generous coat of Mr. Hobby GX114, which tones down the shine of the gloss varnish, I grabbed Tamiya's weathering kit number D, or letter D, I guess. It's a nice kit for weathering aircraft, as it has metallic red and blue colors to create a burnt metal effect, and a brownish grey color for oil stains. I don't like to dirty up my aircraft models too much, but a few strategically placed streaks can go a long way to add to the illusion of realism. Once the weathering was done, I could add the weapon sub-assemblies to both aircraft. At the very end of the build, I installed the pilot seats and canopies into the Diamondbacks model. And with that, both models were done. All things considered, the models weren't a complete fiasco and didn't turn out looking too bad. This road to hell was paved with silly mistakes and thoughtless blunders. Some I managed to fix, some I found workarounds for, and with others I simply had to make my peace. But best of all, the models have finally been built, and that makes me happy. So long, and if you managed to stay awake through the boring bits, I thank you for watching.